In the grand tapestry of human existence, there are moments when a single thread, pulled at just the right time, can prevent an entire section from unraveling. Such threads are rare. Rarer still are the hands brave enough to grasp them when the fabric of civilization itself hangs in the balance. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. Consider, if you will, the summer of 1912. While Europe danced on the precipice of a war that would reshape the world, in Stockholm, Sweden, a child entered existence 3 months after his father had departed it. The boy's name was Raoul Wallenberg, and though he carried the weight of a banking dynasty's reputation, he would never know the guiding hand that might have shaped him into its heir. This absence, this void where paternal wisdom should have resided, would become the defining characteristic of a most extraordinary life. For nature abhors a vacuum, and where Gustav Wallenberg's guidance should have flourished, something else took root instead. Something that would, in time, prove far more powerful than any banking fortune. Picture the young Raoul, growing up in the shadow of Sweden's most influential financial empire. His cousins learned the art of currency exchange, the delicate dance of international commerce, the careful mathematics of profit and loss. But Raoul absorbed different lessons entirely. From his mother, Marge von Dardel, came stories that painted the world not in ledger columns but in stark contrasts of justice and injustice. From his grandfather, Gustav, came something even more precious, the understanding that with great privilege comes an even greater responsibility to those who have none. Imagine, for a moment, watching this transformation unfold, as other children of wealth learned to see the world through the lens of acquisition. Young Wallenberg developed what we might call a naturalist's eye for human suffering. Just as a biologist notices the subtle signs of ecosystem distress, Wallenberg began to perceive the early symptoms of a moral crisis spreading across Europe like a contagion. The 1920s and 30s brought him to America, to the University of Michigan, where the true architecture of his character began to emerge. Here, thousands of miles from Sweden's comfortable neutrality, Wallenberg encountered something his privileged upbringing had not prepared him for: the desperate voices of Jewish students whose relatives in Europe were already whispering of gathering storms. Picture him in those university corridors, a young man whose architectural studies taught him to see not just the blueprints of buildings, but the hidden structures that hold societies together. More importantly, he learned to recognize when those structures were beginning to crack. The letters, his Jewish friends received from home, carried more than family news. They carried the tremors of an approaching earthquake that would shake civilization to its foundations. There is something profound about the way knowledge accumulates in a prepared mind. Wallenberg's years building trade connections in Hungary were not, in themselves, remarkable. Many Swedish businessmen cultivated such relationships. But Wallenberg did something different. He learned Hungarian fluently, not merely the business phrases that would oil commercial transactions, but the poetry of the language, the cultural nuances that would allow him to understand a people's heart. By 1944, while his contemporaries focused on maintaining Sweden's profitable neutrality, Wallenberg possessed something no amount of money could buy: a deep, intuitive understanding of Hungary's people, their customs, their fears, and their hopes. He had spent years not just visiting Budapest, but breathing its air, walking its streets, befriending its citizens. He had become, in essence, a cultural translator between worlds. Consider the magnificent coincidence, or perhaps it was something more than coincidence, that brought all these seemingly unrelated threads together. The Swedish government needed someone to undertake a mission that appeared, on its surface, impossible. They required a person who could navigate the treacherous waters of Nazi-occupied Hungary, someone fluent in the language and customs, someone with business credentials that would open doors, and most importantly, someone willing to risk everything for strangers. In the vast catalogue of human beings available in 1944, how many possessed all these qualifications? How many had spent their lives unconsciously preparing for such a moment? The answer, it seems, was one. Just one. But qualifications alone do not make a hero. Technical skills, cultural knowledge, even diplomatic immunity, these are merely tools. What transforms an ordinary person into someone capable of standing against the machinery of genocide is something far more mysterious. It is the alchemy that occurs when personal loss creates not bitterness, but empathy. When privilege generates not entitlement, but obligation. When safety breeds not complacency, but courage. Wallenberg's father died before he could teach his son the family business, but in doing so, he gave his son something infinitely more valuable, the freedom to discover his own purpose, without the weight of predetermined expectations, without the comfortable assumption that his path was already chosen. Raoul Wallenberg was free to become exactly what the world needed him to be. Think about this for a moment. In the summer of 1944, as the Nazi death machine reached its peak efficiency, as Auschwitz processed human beings with industrial precision, as hope itself seemed to be dying in the cattle cars rolling across Europe at that precise moment, Sweden asked one man to travel to Budapest and do the impossible. They could not have known what they were unleashing. They could not have predicted that this banker's son, shaped by absence rather than presence, educated by stories of injustice rather than balance sheets, would possess the exact combination of skills, knowledge, and moral courage needed to challenge evil itself. On July 9, 1944, Raoul Wallenberg stepped off a train in Budapest carrying Swedish diplomatic credentials and a heart that had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He was 31 years old. Behind him lay years of seemingly random experiences that had woven themselves into perfect preparation. Ahead lay a test of human courage that would echo through generations. But here is what makes his story so remarkable, so worthy of our contemplation as we navigate our own moral challenges. Wallenberg did not set out to become a hero. He did not wake up one morning and decide to save thousands of lives. Instead, he simply responded to a request from his government to help refugees. He said yes to what appeared to be a diplomatic mission. Yet the moment he arrived in Budapest and witnessed what was happening to Hungary's Jews, something extraordinary occurred. All those years of preparation, all those skills and connections and cultural understanding, suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity of purpose. Every thread of his unusual life wove together in an instant, creating a tapestry strong enough to hold the weight of 100,000 lives. This is the mystery that haunts and inspires in equal measure. How does an ordinary person recognize their extraordinary moment? How does someone trained in architecture and business suddenly understand exactly how to dismantle a genocide? How does fear transform into courage, comfort into sacrifice, safety into heroic action? Perhaps the answer lies not in any special quality Wallenberg possessed, but in his willingness to see what others preferred to ignore, to act when others chose to wait, to risk everything when others counted the cost of action, but never the cost of inaction. Tomorrow, we will follow Wallenberg into the hell that was Budapest in 1944, where he would discover that everything he had learned, everything he had become, was about to be tested in ways no human being should ever have to endure. We will witness his descent into a nightmare where 437,000 human beings had already vanished, and where 200,000 more awaited their turn to board the trains to oblivion. But tonight, as you rest, consider this. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is being prepared for their own extraordinary moment. Someone is accumulating skills they do not yet know they will need, developing courage they have not yet been called to use, building connections that will someday become lifelines for others. That someone might be you. The threads of purpose are being woven in ways we cannot yet see, preparing for tests we cannot yet imagine. The question is not whether our moment will come. It is whether we will recognize it when it does, and whether we will have the courage to grasp the thread that could save a civilization from unraveling. There are moments in the natural world when an ecosystem reaches what scientists call a tipping point, that precise instant when balance collapses and the entire system begins to spiral toward catastrophe. On July 9, 1944, as Raoul Wallenberg's train pulled into Budapest's Keleti railway station, he was witnessing such a moment in human civilization. The numbers themselves tell only part of the story. 437,000 Hungarian Jews had already vanished, dissolved into the Nazi machinery of death with such efficiency that their absence seemed to create a vacuum in the city's very atmosphere. But numbers, however staggering, cannot capture the texture of horror that Wallenberg encountered as he stepped onto the platform. Imagine, if you will, the sensory assault that must have overwhelmed him in those first moments. The acrid smell of coal smoke mixing with something far more sinister, the lingering odor of fear that permeates a place where systematic terror has become routine, the sound of boots on cobblestones, always in formation, always purposeful, the sight of yellow stars sewn onto clothing, marking human beings like specimens in some grotesque biological experiment. But Wallenberg possessed something that set him apart from other witnesses to this nightmare. His architect's training had taught him to see beyond surface appearances, to understand the underlying structures that shape what appears on the surface. And what he saw in Budapest was not chaos, but a system, a terrifyingly efficient system designed to process human beings like raw materials in a factory. Adolf Eichmann had transformed genocide into an industrial process. Consider the cold precision of it. 12,000 human beings processed daily toward Auschwitz. 12,000 individual stories, dreams, fears, and hopes, loaded onto cattle cars with the mechanical efficiency of a slaughterhouse. The bureaucracy of death had achieved what its architects intended. It had made mass murder feel routine, even mundane. The Yellow Star houses represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of this system. Here, 200,000 Jews were confined in conditions carefully calibrated to break spirits before bodies. Picture these buildings scattered throughout Budapest, like cells in a diseased organism, each one overcrowded far beyond human endurance, with families of 5 or 6 crammed into single rooms. Sanitation had collapsed, food was scarce, and hope, that most essential of human nutrients, was systematically starved out of existence. Wallenberg walked through streets where children had learned to recognize the sound of approaching trucks, where mothers clutched babies a little tighter whenever boots echoed in stairwells, where elderly rabbis moved through shadows like ghosts of a civilization being methodically erased. At the Józsefváros railway station, he witnessed scenes that would have broken most observers, children torn from their mothers' arms with such casual brutality that it seemed the very bonds of human affection had become inconveniences to be swept aside. Yet something remarkable happened in those first 72 hours. Where others saw only overwhelming horror, Wallenberg's analytical mind began to perceive weaknesses in what appeared to be an invincible system. The Nazi machinery operated on certain assumptions, and those assumptions, he realized, could become vulnerabilities. The first assumption was paperwork. The Third Reich ran on documentation, on official seals and rubber stamps and carbon copies. Every deportation required forms, every confiscation needed authorization. Every human life had to be accounted for in triplicate. This obsession with bureaucracy was designed to create an illusion of legality, to make genocide feel like administrative procedure rather than mass murder. The second assumption was authority. The system depended on unquestioning obedience to official credentials, on the belief that documents bearing certain seals carried the weight of governmental power. Nazi officers had been trained to respect diplomatic immunity, to defer to neutral nation representatives, to maintain the fiction that they were operating within international law. The third assumption was that no one would dare challenge them. The machinery of death had rolled across Europe virtually unopposed because resistance seemed futile. Who would risk their life for strangers? Who would stand in front of cattle cars bound for Auschwitz? Within his first week in Budapest, Wallenberg had identified all 3 vulnerabilities and begun designing what amounted to a counter-system. If the Nazis used paperwork to legitimize murder, he would use paperwork to legitimize life. If they wielded authority through official documents, he would create documents that carried even greater authority. If they assumed no one would dare oppose them, he would prove them catastrophically wrong. The protective passes he designed were masterpieces of psychological warfare disguised as bureaucratic documents. They looked so official, so impressively governmental, that German officers actually saluted Jews carrying them. Picture the profound irony. Symbols of Swedish neutrality being used to shield victims of genocide, pieces of paper becoming more powerful than machine guns. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Wallenberg's system was how quickly it adapted and evolved. When Nazi authorities began questioning the validity of his passes, he simply printed more impressive ones. When they demanded to see his authorization, he produced documents that looked even more official than theirs. When they complained to their superiors, he leveraged Swedish diplomatic pressure to expand his operations rather than curtail them. By August, his operation had transformed from issuing 400 protective passes to printing thousands. Each document represented not just a life saved, but a small rebellion against the massive death machine grinding through Budapest. Consider the psychological impact. In a city where hope had been systematically extracted, where survival seemed impossible, suddenly there were pieces of paper that could stop deportation trains. The effect rippled through Budapest's Jewish community like water through parched earth. Word spread that the Swedish embassy was issuing documents that Nazi officers respected. Desperate families began gathering outside the embassy building, many travelling for days from distant parts of the city, carrying everything they owned in small bundles, placing their faith in a young Swedish diplomat most had never heard of. But Wallenberg understood something that pure compassion alone could never have achieved. He recognized that his system needed to appear completely legitimate, even to Nazi officials who might be suspicious. So he established protocols, created waiting lists, issued numbered documents in careful sequence. He made his rescue operation look so bureaucratically proper that it seemed more official than the deportation system it was subverting. The genius lay not just in what he created, but in what he exploited. The Nazi system's obsession with order and documentation became its own weakness. German officers who would casually murder unarmed civilians found themselves deferring to pieces of paper that bore the right combination of seals, signatures, and official language. Imagine the psychological transformation occurring within Wallenberg himself during these weeks. A man who had arrived in Budapest as a businessman and diplomat, discovering capabilities he never knew he possessed. Each successful rescue revealed new possibilities. Each small victory against the system suggested that the impossible might actually be achievable. Yet every day brought fresh horrors that tested the limits of human endurance. Wallenberg witnessed elderly men beaten in the streets for the crime of existing, saw children disappear into trucks that everyone knew were bound for nowhere good, watched families torn apart with such systematic cruelty that it seemed designed to break not just bodies but souls. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Every decision carried life or death consequences. Every moment of delay could mean another family loaded onto cattle cars. Every mistake could expose his entire operation and doom the thousands who had begun to depend on his protection. But perhaps most remarkably, Wallenberg was beginning to understand that his mission had evolved far beyond its original parameters. What had started as a diplomatic effort to help refugees was becoming something unprecedented in the history of the Holocaust, a systematic, organized challenge to genocide itself. The Nazi machinery had been designed to operate without resistance, to process human beings with the efficiency of any other industrial operation. But now, for the first time, it was encountering something it had not been built to handle, an opponent who understood its methods, exploited its weaknesses, and refused to be intimidated by its power. In the coming weeks, this opposition would escalate into open confrontation. Wallenberg's protective passes would multiply into an entire parallel bureaucracy. His network would expand to include safe houses, soup kitchens, hospitals, and even scout troops for children. His operation would grow so large and sophisticated that Nazi officials would find themselves competing with Swedish documents for control over Budapest's remaining Jewish population. But for now, in these early August days, the foundation was being laid for what would become the most successful individual rescue operation in Holocaust history. Every pass issued, every family protected, every small victory against the system was building toward something extraordinary. Proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, One person's courage could illuminate a path toward hope. In the natural world, when a habitat faces destruction, life responds with remarkable ingenuity. Creatures adapt, evolve, find new ways to survive in environments that seem hostile to their very existence. What Raoul Wallenberg accomplished in Budapest during the autumn of 1944 represents perhaps the most extraordinary example of such adaptation in human history, the transformation of rescue into an art form. Picture, if you will, the Józsefváros railway station on a grey October morning. Steam rises from cattle cars packed with human cargo, their destination a name that had become synonymous with death, Auschwitz. Nazi guards patrol the platform with mechanical efficiency, their rifles ready to discourage any interference with the deportation process. This is the moment when most reasonable people would step back, when self-preservation would whisper its urgent warnings. Instead, Raoul Wallenberg climbs onto the roof of a deportation train. Consider the audacity of this image. A Swedish diplomat in an expensive overcoat, crawling across the metal surface of a moving train while guards fire warning shots around him, pushing protective passes through ventilation slats to terrified families trapped below. These were not the actions of a trained rescue operative or a military commando. This was a banker's son who had discovered that impossible circumstances sometimes require impossible solutions. The protective passes themselves were marvels of creative bureaucracy. Wallenberg had realized something profound about the Nazi system. It respected authority more than humanity, documents more than people. So he created documents that carried more authority than any Nazi official could question. Each pass bore the Swedish crown, official seals, and language so formal and impressive that German officers actually stepped aside when Jews presented them. But Wallenberg's genius extended far beyond paperwork. When Nazi authorities demanded Jews who were already loaded onto deportation trains, he developed tactics that bordered on theatre. Picture him standing on railway platforms, shouting made-up names into cattle cars. Erich Goldstein, Maria Weiss, David Rosenberg. Inside those darkened cars, desperate people understood the miracle they were witnessing. Someone was offering them fictional identities to claim, new names that could transform them from condemned victims into protected persons. Yes, that is me. Voices would call back from the darkness. I am Erich Goldstein. And incredibly, Nazi guards would actually release these people, handing them over to Swedish protection based on nothing more than claimed names and Wallenberg's unshakable confidence that he had the authority to demand their release. The psychology behind these encounters was as sophisticated as it was desperate. Wallenberg had studied his opponents, understanding that Nazi efficiency depended on maintaining an illusion of legality, by forcing them to choose between respecting Swedish diplomatic immunity and openly violating international law. He placed them in an impossible position. Most often, they chose to defer to his authority, rather than create diplomatic incidents that might reach their superiors. But individual rescues, however dramatic, could not address the scale of the catastrophe unfolding in Budapest. Wallenberg needed infrastructure, a systematic approach that could protect thousands simultaneously. This is when his architectural training proved most valuable. He began designing not just rescue operations, but an entire parallel system of complete protection. The 32 safe houses he established represented one of the most audacious experiments in international law ever attempted. Each building was declared Swedish territory, marked with Sweden's blue and yellow flag, and protected by diplomatic immunity. Picture these structures scattered throughout Budapest, like islands of safety in an ocean of terror. Inside their walls, international law created a bubble of protection that Nazi authorities could not legally penetrate. The logistics of maintaining these safe houses staggers the imagination. 20,000 Jews required food, water, medical care, and hope. Wallenberg established hospitals staffed by Jewish doctors, soup kitchens that fed hundreds daily, and even a scout troop to give children some semblance of normalcy amid the chaos. Each building became a miniature city-state with its own governance, its own rules, its own determination to preserve life in the face of systematic death. Consider the remarkable scene inside these buildings during air raids. While Nazi authorities huddled in bunkers, Jews under Swedish protection remained in their apartments, protected not by reinforced concrete, but by pieces of paper that declared them immune from persecution. The psychological impact was as important as the physical safety. For the first time since the occupation began, Jews in Budapest could sleep without fear of midnight deportations. The confrontation with Adolf Eichmann at the Astoria Hotel has become legendary, and for good reason. Here were two men representing opposite poles of human nature, sharing dinner while verbally dueling over the fate of thousands. Eichmann, the architect of industrial genocide, sat across from Wallenberg, the architect of systematic rescue. The conversation that ensued reveals everything about the moral universe in which this drama was playing out. "I will personally make sure you disappear," Eichmann reportedly threatened, his voice carrying the weight of an Alatese's organization that had already made millions vanish. "I represent the Swedish government," Wallenberg replied calmly. "Any action against me would constitute an act of war against a neutral nation." Picture this exchange unfolding over wine and conversation, two professionals discussing logistics with the politeness of a business meeting. Yet beneath the civilized surface, they were negotiating for human souls. Eichmann's entire career had been built on the assumption that no one would dare challenge the Nazi death machine. Wallenberg's presence represented something he had never encountered: organized, systematic resistance backed by international law. The forgery operation that Wallenberg established demonstrates the full scope of his creative genius. His staff produced protective documents faster than authorities could verify them, creating a bureaucratic maze that saved lives through confusion. Each document was a small masterpiece of deception, bearing seals and signatures that looked more official than genuine Nazi paperwork. But perhaps most remarkably, Wallenberg understood that his operation needed to evolve constantly to stay ahead of Nazi countermeasures. When authorities began checking document serial numbers, he created new series with different numbering systems. When they questioned Swedish authority, he produced letters from Stockholm authorizing expanded operations. When they demanded proof of Swedish citizenship for protected persons, he organized citizenship ceremonies inside the embassy itself. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical rescue. Every successful operation sent a message throughout Budapest that the Nazi system was not invincible. Jewish families began to believe that survival was possible. Even Nazi officials started to question whether their deportation orders were more important than avoiding diplomatic incidents with neutral Sweden. As autumn progressed toward winter, a crisis emerged that would test everything Wallenberg had built. The Arrow Cross, Hungary's own fascist party, had taken control of the government in October. Unlike their German allies, who maintained at least a pretense of legal procedure, the Arrow Cross operated with pure brutality. They planned to massacre the ghetto's remaining 70,000 Jews in a final orgy of violence before Soviet forces could liberate the city. This is when Wallenberg demonstrated perhaps the most extraordinary moral courage in his entire story. Facing down Arrow Cross leaders who had already proven their willingness to commit mass murder, he made a threat that seems impossible in retrospect. He told them that if they proceeded with their plans, he would personally ensure they faced prosecution for war crimes after the war ended. Consider the audacity of this moment. A Swedish diplomat, alone and vastly outnumbered, threatening Hungarian fascists with post-war justice at a time when Nazi victory still seemed possible. He had no army, no weapons, no enforcement mechanism beyond his own moral authority. Yet somehow, his threat carried enough weight to prevent a final massacre that would have rivaled anything in the Holocaust's history. The success of this intervention reveals something profound about the nature of evil. Even the most hardened perpetrators of genocide retained some awareness that their actions might eventually face judgment. Wallenberg's threat worked not because he had the power to enforce it immediately, but because he forced them to confront the possibility that their crimes would not remain forever hidden. By Christmas of 1944, Wallenberg's operation had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of the Holocaust. He had created a functioning parallel government within Nazi-occupied territory, complete with hospitals, schools, food distribution systems, and diplomatic protection for tens of thousands of people. His network employed hundreds of volunteers, operated across dozens of buildings, and had saved approximately 100,000 lives. The numbers are staggering, but they tell only part of the story. What Wallenberg accomplished was not just rescue, but the preservation of hope itself. In a city where systematic murder had become routine, where survival seemed impossible, he had proven that one person's refusal to accept evil could create islands of sanctuary in an ocean of horror. Each protective pass issued, each family sheltered, each confrontation with Nazi authorities was building toward something larger than any individual rescue. Wallenberg was demonstrating that even in humanity's darkest hour, moral courage could illuminate a path toward survival. He was proving that systems designed to destroy life could be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated by someone who refused to accept that genocide was inevitable. But as Soviet forces approached Budapest in December, Wallenberg faced a new and unexpected threat. Liberation was coming, but it would bring its own dangers. The very success that had made him a hero to thousands of grateful Jews was about to make him something else entirely. A person who knew too much, who had seen too much, who represented a threat to powers that preferred their secrets buried with their victims. The architecture of rescue that Wallenberg had so carefully constructed was about to encounter forces that operated by entirely different rules, in a world where saving lives might be considered as dangerous as taking them. In the natural world, predators often display a phenomenon that scientists call convergent evolution, different species, operating in different environments, developing remarkably similar hunting strategies. What happened to Raoul Wallenberg in January 1945 reveals a disturbing truth about totalitarian systems. Whether fascist or communist, they share certain fundamental characteristics, particularly their treatment of individuals who have witnessed too much. January 17, 1945. Soviet artillery had been pounding Budapest for weeks, driving Nazi forces into desperate retreat. The Red Army's advance should have represented liberation for the Jews. Wallenberg had spent months protecting. Instead, it marked the beginning of a mystery that would consume investigators for the next 70 years. Picture the scene as Soviet forces finally broke through the city's defenses. Instead of celebrating liberation, Wallenberg was still working frantically, moving between his safe houses, ensuring that his charges would survive the chaotic transition from Nazi occupation to Soviet liberation. While others might have considered their mission complete, Wallenberg understood that vulnerable people remain vulnerable regardless of who controls the territory around them. On that grey January morning, he made a decision that reveals everything about his character. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's headquarters had established itself in Debrecen, roughly 200 kilometers from Budapest. Wallenberg, carrying his diplomatic credentials and detailed plans for helping Budapest's surviving Jews rebuild their lives, decided to approach the Soviet command voluntarily. Consider the profound irony of this moment. A man who had spent months evading Nazi authorities, who had developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate hostile bureaucracies, walked willingly into the headquarters of what he believed would be a friendly army. He carried with him not just diplomatic immunity, but the moral authority of someone who had saved 100,000 lives. Surely, he must have reasoned, the Soviets would welcome his assistance in caring for Holocaust survivors. He expected a brief meeting, perhaps some coordination on relief efforts, and a quick return to Budapest to continue his humanitarian work. Instead, Smersh agents, Stalin's military counterintelligence service, detained him immediately. The man who had outsmarted the Nazi deportation machine, who had frustrated Adolf Eichmann himself, disappeared into the Soviet security apparatus like a stone dropped into a deep well. The initial Soviet explanation was almost insultingly simple. According to official statements released in 1957, Wallenberg had died of a heart attack on July 17, 1947, while imprisoned in Lubyanka, the KGB's most notorious facility. The death certificate was signed by officials who claimed they had been trying to negotiate his release when this unfortunate medical emergency occurred. But like so many Soviet explanations, this story began to crumble almost immediately under scrutiny. The date itself was suspicious, exactly 2 years after his disappearance, as if someone had chosen it for its neat symmetry rather than its accuracy. The circumstances were equally implausible. Why would the Soviets hold a Swedish diplomat for 2.5 years before attempting to negotiate his release? What possible threat could one humanitarian worker pose to the mighty Soviet state? More troubling still were the details that didn't appear in the official account. Why had Wallenberg's belongings been systematically catalogued and preserved by Soviet security services? Why were his diplomatic papers found decades later in KGB archives, carefully filed and annotated? If he had simply died of natural causes while awaiting release, why the elaborate documentation of his personal effects? The first cracks in the official story appeared in the 1960s, when former prisoners began sharing accounts that painted a very different picture. Marvin Markkinen, an American student imprisoned in Vladimir Central Prison in 1961, reported conversations with someone in an adjacent cell who matched Wallenberg's description perfectly. The man spoke Swedish, claimed to be a diplomat, and had been imprisoned since 1945. Consider the psychological torture implied by these accounts. If Wallenberg was indeed alive in 1961, he had spent 16 years in Soviet prisons, cut off from all contact with the outside world, unaware that his family was desperately searching for him, ignorant of the fact that his story had become an international symbol of humanitarian courage. But Makkinen's testimony was not isolated. Kirill Osmak, a Ukrainian prisoner released in 1978, claimed to have had lengthy conversations with a Swedish diplomat in Vladimir Central Prison during the early 1970s. The man Osmak described possessed detailed knowledge of Stockholm, spoke fluent Hungarian, and had been imprisoned since the end of World War II. The pattern of witness testimony reveals something deeply disturbing about Soviet prison practices. Multiple former prisoners, held in different facilities at different times, reported encounters with someone matching Wallenberg's description. Yet these accounts were always fragmentary, always second-hand, always just beyond absolute verification. It was as if the Soviet system had perfected the art of making someone disappear while keeping them alive, creating a bureaucratic limbo between existence and non-existence. Perhaps most haunting were the coded communications that allegedly passed between prison cells. Former inmates reported tapping on walls that spelled out Wallenberg in prisoner Morse code. These messages suggested not just survival, but a desperate attempt to communicate with the outside world, to somehow signal that Raoul Wallenberg was still alive decades after his supposed death. The systematic destruction of evidence reveals the true scope of the Soviet cover-up. When KGB archives were partially opened during Glasnost, researchers discovered that Wallenberg's file had been cleaned, hundreds of pages removed or destroyed on direct orders from the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The surviving documents raised more questions than they answered, containing references to interrogations, medical examinations, and transfers between facilities that extended far beyond the 1947 death date. One document in particular stands out for its implications. A 1948 memo references discussions about the Wallenberg problem at the highest levels of Soviet leadership, more than 6 months after his supposed death. If Wallenberg had indeed died of natural causes in July 1947, why were Soviet officials still discussing him as a problem requiring solutions? The motivations behind Wallenberg's detention remain as mysterious as his fate. Initial theories focused on simple bureaucratic confusion. Perhaps Soviet authorities genuinely suspected him of espionage and detained him pending investigation. But as years passed without release or even acknowledgement of his imprisonment, other explanations emerged. Some historians suggest that Wallenberg possessed information about secret negotiations between Nazi officials and Western allies, discussions that Stalin wanted suppressed to maintain Soviet claims about Western cooperation with fascists. Others theorize that his American connections and funding made him valuable as a potential bargaining chip in post-war negotiations. But perhaps the most chilling explanation is also the simplest. Wallenberg represented something that totalitarian systems cannot tolerate, proof that individual moral courage can effectively challenge state power. His success in Budapest had demonstrated that one person's refusal to accept evil could save thousands of lives. For a regime built on the premise that individuals are powerless against state authority, Wallenberg's very existence posed an ideological threat. Consider the psychological profile that emerges from Soviet behavior. They could not release Wallenberg because his story would expose uncomfortable truths about state power and individual resistance. They could not execute him because he was too prominent, too well connected, too likely to become a martyr. So they chose a third option, making him disappear so completely that his fate would remain forever uncertain. The bureaucratic machinery that accomplished this disappearance reveals the sophisticated cruelty of the Soviet system. Unlike Nazi genocide, which was designed to eliminate victims quickly and efficiently, Soviet repression specialized in erasing people slowly, methodically, leaving just enough uncertainty to prevent closure, while ensuring that hope remained forever unresolved. Former KGB officer Pavel Sudoplatov's memoirs, published in the 1990s, hinted at the true scope of the Wallenberg case. According to Sudoplatov, Wallenberg was considered so sensitive that only the highest levels of Soviet leadership were authorized to make decisions about his fate. His case was reviewed repeatedly over the 2 years, with officials weighing the risks of release against the complications of continued imprisonment. In 2016, new documents emerged from Russian archives, showing that Soviet officials were still discussing Wallenberg as late as February 1948, nearly 8 months after his supposed death. These discussions referenced his potential value in prisoner exchanges and the complications his case created for Soviet-Swedish relations. Each revelation deepens the mystery while confirming that someone powerful wanted Raoul Wallenberg to vanish completely from history. The man who had saved 100,000 lives by challenging totalitarian authority had become too dangerous to release, too valuable to execute, too problematic to acknowledge. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Wallenberg's disappearance is not its impact on him, but its effect on those he had saved. Imagine the survivors of the Budapest ghetto, people who owed their lives to his courage, spending decades wondering whether their savior was still alive somewhere in the Soviet prison system. The uncertainty became a form of collective psychological torture, preventing closure not just for Wallenberg's family, but for the thousands who remembered his kindness. As Soviet forces consolidated control over Eastern Europe, Wallenberg's fate became a symbol of everything the Cold War represented. The clash between individual rights and state power, between humanitarian values and political calculation, between truth and the machinery of denial that kept totalitarian systems functioning. Somewhere in the vast network of Soviet prisons, a man who had proven that one person could challenge genocide had himself become a victim of a different kind of systematic oppression. The architecture of rescue that he had so carefully constructed in Budapest was now reversed. He had become the one who needed rescue, trapped in a system designed to make people disappear without trace. In the world of marine biology, there exists a phenomenon known as the deep scattering layer, mysterious acoustic signatures detected in ocean depths that suggest life forms moving in coordinated patterns far below the surface. For 70 years, the search for Raoul Wallenberg has operated on similar principles, with investigators detecting faint but persistent signals of survival buried deep within the archives of totalitarian bureaucracy. The hunt began with a mother's love. Maj von Dardel, Wallenberg's mother, refused to accept Soviet explanations about her son's fate, with the tenacity of someone who understands that maternal instinct operates by different rules than diplomatic protocol. From 1945 until her death in 1979, she wrote approximately 10,000 letters to world leaders, government officials, and international organizations, each one demanding answers that never came. Picture this remarkable woman, aging gracefully in Stockholm, while maintaining a correspondence that spanned the globe. Letters to Winston Churchill, to Franklin Roosevelt, to Stalin himself, pleas to the International Red Cross, appeals to the United Nations, desperate communications with anyone who might have influence over Soviet decision-making. For 33 years, she lived in a state of suspended hope, never knowing whether her next letter might finally break through the wall of official silence. Her persistence was not mere maternal denial. Maj von Dardel understood something that diplomats often missed, that bureaucratic systems, however sophisticated, eventually leave traces. Somewhere in the vast machinery of Soviet record-keeping, evidence of her son's fate existed. The challenge was finding someone willing to look for it. Guy von Dardel, Wallenberg's half-brother, transformed himself from physicist to amateur detective with the methodical precision that scientific training provides. Where others saw insurmountable obstacles, Guy saw problems requiring systematic analysis. He studied Soviet prison transport records with the same attention to detail he had once applied to nuclear research, looking for patterns that might reveal his brother's location. The breakthrough came during Glasnost, when Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms cracked open archives that had remained sealed since Stalin's era. Suddenly, researchers who had spent decades operating on rumors and speculation gained access to actual documents. What they found was both illuminating and frustrating. Evidence that Wallenberg had indeed survived much longer than Soviet authorities claimed, but also proof that his file had been systematically cleaned of the most crucial information. Consider the psychological impact of these discoveries on investigators who had devoted their lives to solving this mystery. After 40 years of searching, they finally held genuine Soviet documents in their hands. The excitement must have been overwhelming, until they realized that the most important pages had been deliberately removed. Someone had anticipated this moment, had prepared for the eventual opening of archives by ensuring that the most sensitive information would never see daylight. In 1991, a joint Swedish-Russian commission gained unprecedented access to previously classified materials. The commission's work revealed evidence that Wallenberg had been interrogated personally by Viktor Abakumov, Stalin's security chief, a detail that elevated the case from routine imprisonment to involvement at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Men like Abakumov did not personally interrogate ordinary prisoners. Their attention was reserved for cases that touched on state security at the most sensitive levels. The discovery of numbered prisoner cards provided perhaps the most tantalizing evidence yet uncovered. These cards, used to track prisoner movements within the Soviet system, showed entries for Wallenberg extending at least until 1947, and possibly much longer. The numbering system itself suggested survival far beyond the official death date, with cards bearing sequences that continued into the early 1950s. But it was the testimony of former prisoners that provided the most compelling evidence for extended survival. Marvin Makinen's account was particularly detailed because of the unique circumstances of his imprisonment as an American student caught attempting to retrieve scientific equipment near the Soviet border. Makinen was held in high-security facilities, typically reserved for political prisoners. His cell in Vladimir Central Prison shared a wall with someone who claimed to be Swedish, spoke multiple languages, and had been imprisoned since the end of World War II. The conversations Makinen described revealed intimate details about Swedish culture, Stockholm geography, and diplomatic protocol that would have been impossible for an ordinary criminal to know. More significantly, the man in the adjacent cell demonstrated knowledge of Hungarian language and customs that exactly matched Wallenberg's background. When Makinen was finally released and debriefed by American intelligence services, his testimony was considered credible enough to prompt official diplomatic inquiries. Kirill Osmak's story added another layer to the mystery. Released from Vladimir Central Prison in 1978 after serving 15 years for Ukrainian nationalism, Osmak claimed extensive conversations with a Swedish diplomat who had been held since 1945. The man Osmak described possessed encyclopedic knowledge of European politics, spoke fluent Hungarian and Russian, and displayed the kind of cultural sophistication that matched Wallenberg's background perfectly. What made these testimonies particularly compelling was their consistency across time and location. Multiple prisoners, held in different facilities during different decades, reported encounters with someone matching Wallenberg's description. The details were too specific, too consistent, and too knowledgeable to be coincidental, yet they were also fragmentary enough to maintain plausible deniability for Soviet authorities. The coded communications between prison cells reveal perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Wallenberg's possible survival. Former prisoners described elaborate tapping systems used to communicate through cell walls, with messages that sometimes spelled out Wallenberg in prisoner Morse code. These communications suggested not just survival, but desperate attempts to make contact with the outside world, to somehow signal that Raoul Wallenberg was still alive decades after his supposed death. Pavel Sudoplatov's memoirs, published after the Soviet Union's collapse, provided insider perspective on the bureaucratic machinery that had consumed Wallenberg. As a former KGB officer involved in foreign operations, Sudoplatov suggested that Wallenberg possessed information about separate peace negotiations between Nazi officials and Western allies, knowledge that Stalin wanted suppressed to maintain Soviet propaganda about Western collaboration with fascists. According to Sudoplatov, Wallenberg's case was reviewed repeatedly at the highest levels of Soviet leadership, with officials weighing the political costs of release against the security risks of disclosure. Each review apparently concluded that the risks were too great, condemning Wallenberg to continued imprisonment for crimes he had never committed. The 2016 document discoveries added new dimensions to the mystery. Russian archivists uncovered memos showing that Soviet officials were still discussing the Wallenberg problem as late as February 1948, nearly 8 months after his supposed death. These discussions referenced his potential value in prisoner exchanges and the diplomatic complications his case created for Soviet-Swedish relations. More disturbing still was evidence of deliberate misinformation campaigns designed to confuse international investigators. Soviet authorities apparently spread false stories about Wallenberg's death, while simultaneously maintaining him in secret imprisonment. The sophistication of this disinformation operation suggests involvement at the highest levels of Soviet intelligence services. Consider the psychological profile that emerges from this pattern of behavior. The Soviets could not simply execute Wallenberg because his prominence made him too valuable as a potential bargaining chip. They could not release him because his testimony would expose uncomfortable truths about Soviet occupation policies in Eastern Europe. So they chose a third option, maintaining him in a bureaucratic limbo that allowed them to claim he was dead while keeping him available for future use. The families of other disappeared prisoners have often found closure through death certificates, grave sites, or witness testimony about executions. But Wallenberg's family has been denied even this terrible mercy. For 7 decades, they have lived with uncertainty that prevents mourning while nurturing impossible hope. Recent DNA testing of remains discovered in Russian archives has provided both hope and frustration. While none of the tested samples have matched Wallenberg's genetic profile, the very existence of unidentified remains from the Stalin era suggests that many cases remain unsolved. Each negative result eliminates one possibility, while confirming that the search must continue. The international dimension of the investigation has created its own complications. Swedish authorities, Russian officials, American intelligence services, and international human rights organizations have all pursued parallel investigations that sometimes conflict with each other. Each organization operates according to different political constraints, different access to classified information, and different definitions of what constitutes acceptable evidence. Modern technology has opened new avenues for investigation. Satellite imagery can now identify former prison sites that have been demolished or abandoned. Digital analysis of Soviet documents can detect alterations, additions, and deletions that were invisible to earlier investigators. Voice recognition software could potentially match recordings of Wallenberg's speeches with prisoner communications smuggled out of Soviet facilities. Yet for all the technological advancement, the fundamental mystery remains unchanged. Somewhere in the vast archipelago of Soviet prison camps, a man who saved 100,000 lives disappeared into a system designed to make people vanish without trace. Whether he survived for months, years, or decades beyond his official death date, his fate represents one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. The search continues not just because of historical curiosity, but because Wallenberg's disappearance symbolizes something larger than any individual case. His story represents the eternal struggle between state power and individual conscience, between bureaucratic machinery and human dignity, between the forces that seek to erase moral courage and those that insist on preserving its memory. Every document discovered, every witness interviewed, every archive opened brings investigators closer to truth, while revealing how much remains hidden. The hunt for Raoul Wallenberg has become a hunt for accountability itself, proof that even the most sophisticated systems of oppression cannot completely erase the evidence of their crimes. In the study of physics, scientists have discovered that certain particles become more powerful when they exist in states of uncertainty, their potential energy multiplied by the very impossibility of pinning down their exact location. Raoul Wallenberg's disappearance has created a similar phenomenon in human consciousness, transforming him from hero to legend through the mystery that surrounds his fate. Consider the paradox. A man whose life was dedicated to saving others has achieved immortality through uncertainty about his death. Where traditional monuments fade and historical accounts gather dust, Wallenberg's unfinished story continues to generate new rescuers, new acts of courage, new refusals to accept evil as inevitable. His vanishing has become more powerful than any conclusion could have been. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum credits Wallenberg with demonstrating something that had never been proven before: that one person's choices can disrupt genocide. This is not mere historical appreciation, but active instruction in the mechanics of moral courage. Every year, thousands of visitors study his methods, learning that protective documents can be more powerful than weapons, that bureaucratic confusion can save lives, that individual conscience can challenge systematic evil. His techniques have been adapted and applied in crisis zones around the world. In Rwanda, during the 1994 genocide, hotel manager Paul Rusesabagina used similar tactics, creating false documentation, exploiting bureaucratic procedures, leveraging international connections to protect over 1,000 Tutsi refugees. The parallels to Wallenberg's operations are unmistakable, understanding that evil systems often respect their own rules more than human life, and using those rules as weapons against the system itself. In Syria, humanitarian workers have employed Wallenberg-inspired methods to evacuate civilians from besieged areas. By creating official-looking documents, establishing fake diplomatic credentials, and exploiting confusion between competing authorities, modern rescuers have saved thousands, using tactics pioneered in Budapest 70 years ago. The architecture of rescue that Wallenberg designed has proven remarkably adaptable to contemporary conflicts. Picture the moment when aid workers in Aleppo realized they could create protective passes similar to Wallenberg's design. Using desktop computers instead of printing presses, email instead of diplomatic pouches, they established networks of safe houses and evacuation routes that echo his original system. The technology had advanced, but the fundamental insight remained unchanged. Bureaucratic authority can be exploited by those creative enough to understand its weaknesses. The Raoul Wallenberg Foundation, established by descendants of those he saved, has trained thousands in what they call civil courage, the practical skills needed to intervene when witnessing persecution. Their workshops teach Wallenberg's methods adapted for contemporary situations: how to create authoritative documentation, how to leverage international law, how to build networks of protection for vulnerable populations. But perhaps most remarkably, these training programs reveal how many people carry within themselves the potential for extraordinary moral action. Participants often discover capabilities they never knew they possessed: the ability to think clearly under pressure, to create solutions from impossible circumstances, to risk everything for strangers. Wallenberg's story serves as permission to access courage that already exists but requires activation. The genetic and geographic spread of Wallenberg's impact defies traditional historical analysis. Researchers estimate that over 200,000 people alive today descend from those he saved in Budapest. Each of these individuals carries not just biological inheritance, but cultural memory of rescue, family stories about the Swedish diplomat who appeared when hope seemed impossible. Consider the exponential mathematics of survival. Every person Wallenberg saved became a parent, grandparent, great-grandparent to dozens of others. Teachers, doctors, artists, scientists, ordinary people, living extraordinary lives because one man refused to accept that genocide was inevitable. Their existence represents perhaps the most powerful refutation of totalitarian ideology ever created, proof that individual conscience can literally multiply life across generations. Sweden made him its first honorary citizen in 1981, followed by the United States later that same year, only the second person after Winston Churchill to receive this honor from America. But these official recognitions pale beside the grassroots memorialization that has emerged organically around the world. Streets bear his name in cities from Budapest to Tel Aviv, schools teach his methods to new generations, and organizations invoke his example whenever humanitarian crises demand impossible responses. The educational impact of Wallenberg's story extends far beyond Holocaust studies. In curricula worldwide, his example appears in courses on conflict resolution, international law, human rights, and moral philosophy. Students learn not just what he accomplished, but how he accomplished it, the specific techniques that transformed one person's conscience into a system capable of challenging genocide. Modern technology has amplified his teaching potential exponentially. Online courses reach students who might never visit physical museums. Virtual reality experiences allow people to walk through recreated safe houses, and interactive simulations let participants practice making decisions under pressure, similar to those Wallenberg faced daily. His story has become a laboratory for studying moral courage under extreme conditions. The International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation continues searching for truth about his fate, while simultaneously spreading his message of active resistance to injustice. This dual mission, historical investigation and contemporary application, reflects the unique power of his unfinished story. Unlike completed narratives that inspire, but remain safely in the past, Wallenberg's mystery demands ongoing engagement with present-day moral challenges. Every year, new Wallenberg medals recognize individuals who risk everything to save others, creating a global network of people committed to his principles. Recipients include journalists who expose genocide, diplomats who shelter refugees, ordinary citizens who hide persecuted families. Each medal ceremony reinforces the message that moral courage is not rare genetic mutation, but learnable skill available to anyone willing to practice it. Consider the psychological impact on medal recipients themselves. By connecting their actions to Wallenberg's legacy, the awards program creates a sense of continuity, a feeling that they are continuing his work rather than starting from scratch. This connection to historical precedent can provide crucial emotional support during dangerous interventions, reminding rescuers that they are part of a tradition that has proven effective against seemingly impossible odds. The digital age has created new platforms for Wallenberg's influence. Social media campaigns use his quotes and images to mobilize responses to contemporary crises. Online fundraising efforts invoke his example when seeking donations for refugee assistance. Documentary films and podcasts introduce his story to audiences who might never encounter it through traditional educational channels. But perhaps most significantly, his story has become a touchstone for discussions about individual responsibility in the face of systematic injustice. In classrooms, boardrooms, and public forums around the world, people ask themselves, what would Wallenberg do when confronting modern forms of persecution? This question has become a moral compass, pointing toward action rather than inaction, courage rather than comfort. The paradox deepens when we consider how his uncertain fate actually strengthens his moral authority. Had Wallenberg died peacefully, in old age, honored and celebrated, his story might have become comfortable inspiration, admirable but safely historical. Instead, his disappearance keeps his challenge alive and immediate. He remains forever suspended between triumph and tragedy, between rescue and victimization, embodying the precarious nature of moral courage itself. Some historians argue that knowing exactly when and how Wallenberg died would actually diminish his power as a symbol. In remaining forever suspended between life and death, between heroism and suffering, he embodies the eternal human struggle against injustice. His ghost haunts every moment we choose safety over righteousness, every time we rationalize inaction in the face of persecution. This haunting quality explains why his story spreads like wildfire among young people especially. Unlike historical figures who seem safely removed from contemporary concerns, Wallenberg feels present and urgent. His choices demand responses not about what can happen to him, but about what we will do when our moment comes. The man who saved 100,000 lives asks each of us, what is your life worth if not spent defending others? The question reverberates through every generation that discovers his story anew. In refugee camps where aid workers risk kidnapping to deliver supplies, in courtrooms where lawyers challenge unjust laws, in corporate boardrooms where executives must choose between profit and principle, Wallenberg's example provides both inspiration and instruction for navigating impossible moral terrain. His immortality through mystery has created something unprecedented in human history, a legend that grows stronger rather than weaker with time, a story that generates more action than any monument could inspire, a disappeared hero whose absence has become more powerful than any presence could have been. The search for truth about his fate continues, but the search for people willing to follow his example has already succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. In a world where systematic oppression continues to threaten vulnerable populations, Wallenberg's legacy operates like a moral virus, spreading from person to person, generation to generation, inspiring new rescuers wherever it takes root. Perhaps this is the final lesson of his extraordinary life and mysterious disappearance. That true heroism lies not in seeking recognition or reward, but in planting seeds of courage that will bloom long after the gardener has vanished from sight. Raoul Wallenberg may have disappeared into the Soviet prison system, but his spirit escaped and multiplied, ensuring that his work of rescue continues wherever human beings refuse to accept that evil is stronger than good. In quantum physics, there exists a principle known as the observer effect, the idea that the very act of observation changes the nature of what is being observed. After 7 decades of investigation, the search for Raoul, Wallenberg has created a similar phenomenon, where the questions raised by his disappearance have become more important than any answers we might eventually discover. Why did the Soviets take Wallenberg? This question burns as brightly today as it did in 1945, despite thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of witness testimonies, and dozens of official investigations. The mystery has survived Glasnost, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the opening of previously sealed archives. Each new revelation seems to deepen rather than resolve the fundamental puzzle of his fate. Perhaps he knew too much about secret negotiations between Western allies and Nazi officials. During the final months of World War II, desperate German commanders were indeed reaching out to American and British representatives, seeking separate peace agreements that would allow them to surrender to Western forces rather than face Soviet occupation. If Wallenberg had witnessed or participated in such discussions, his testimony could have undermined Soviet propaganda about Western complicity with fascism. Consider the psychological impact such knowledge would have had on Stalin's paranoid worldview. The Soviet leader already suspected his Western allies of plotting against him, already believed that capitalist powers would eventually turn their weapons eastward. Evidence of separate peace negotiations would have confirmed his worst fears while providing justification for his most repressive policies toward anyone who might possess such information. Or maybe the explanation lies in what Wallenberg represented, rather than what he knew. His successful challenge to totalitarian power in Budapest had demonstrated something that no authoritarian system can tolerate: proof that individual conscience can effectively resist state authority. For a regime built on the premise that citizens are powerless against government control, Wallenberg's very existence posed an ideological threat that transcended any specific information he might have possessed. Picture Stalin reviewing reports of Wallenberg's operations. One Swedish diplomat had frustrated the Nazi deportation machine, saved tens of thousands of lives, and proven that bureaucratic systems could be outmaneuvered by someone clever enough to exploit their weaknesses. The implications were staggering. If one person could challenge Nazi authority so effectively, what might prevent Soviet citizens from attempting similar resistance against their own government? The timing of Wallenberg's detention supports this interpretation. Soviet forces arrested him not during the chaos of Budapest's liberation, but weeks later, after they had time to study his methods and understand their implications. The decision to detain him appears calculated rather than impulsive, suggesting deliberate policy rather than bureaucratic confusion. Perhaps his American connections made him suspect in Soviet eyes. The War Refugee Board that funded his mission was indeed a United States government agency, and his rescue operations in Budapest were coordinated with American intelligence services. In Stalin's increasingly paranoid worldview, anyone with such connections automatically became a potential spy, regardless of their humanitarian motivations. But the most troubling possibility is also the simplest, that Wallenberg became a victim of a system that destroyed what it didn't understand. Soviet security services in 1945 operated according to institutional paranoia that treated any foreign contact as potentially treasonous. Wallenberg may have been swept up in procedures designed to eliminate anyone who might pose even theoretical threats to state security. Consider the bureaucratic momentum that such systems generate. Once Wallenberg entered the Soviet prison apparatus, releasing him would have required someone to take responsibility for the original decision to detain him. In Stalin's Soviet Union, admitting mistakes was often more dangerous than perpetuating them. Each passing year made release more difficult to justify, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that trapped Wallenberg in administrative limbo. The sophistication of the cover-up suggests that his case eventually reached the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The systematic destruction of documents, the coordination of false information across multiple agencies, the careful timing of official explanations. These actions required resources and authority that only senior officials could command. Someone powerful decided that Wallenberg's fate must remain forever uncertain. Yet, after 70 years of investigation, the final truth likely rests in archives still sealed, documents still classified, or memories taken to unmarked graves. Despite glasnost, despite archival openings, despite international pressure, crucial information about Wallenberg's fate remains hidden. This suggests that his case touches on secrets that current Russian leadership still considers too sensitive for disclosure, but perhaps the enduring mystery serves a purpose beyond historical curiosity. Each generation that discovers Wallenberg's story must grapple with fundamental questions that have no easy answers. What would make someone abandon comfort for danger? How does one person's conscience stand against systematic evil? Would we have his courage when our moment comes? These questions cannot be answered abstractly. They require personal reflection, individual decision-making, moral commitment that can only be tested under pressure. Wallenberg's uncertain fate keeps these questions alive and immediate, forcing each of us to imagine ourselves in his position and consider how we would respond. Picture young people discovering his story for the first time. They cannot dismiss his choices as belonging to a safely distant past, because his fate remains unresolved. They cannot treat his courage as museum, peace inspiration, because the mystery demands contemporary engagement. His story refuses to be filed away as completed history, instead insisting on present-tense relevance that challenges every reader to examine their own moral preparation. Some historians argue that knowing exactly when and how Wallenberg died would actually diminish his power as a symbol. In remaining forever suspended between life and death, between heroism and suffering, he embodies the eternal human struggle against injustice. His ghost haunts every moment we choose safety over righteousness, every time we rationalize inaction in the face of persecution. The psychological impact of unresolved fate extends beyond intellectual curiosity to emotional engagement. Families of Holocaust survivors still wonder whether their rescuer might have survived decades in Soviet prisons, suffering in silence while they rebuilt their lives in freedom. This uncertainty creates a form of moral debt that cannot be repaid but must be honored through continued commitment to his principles. Consider the ethical implications of this perpetual uncertainty. Does society have an obligation to continue searching for truth about Wallenberg's fate, even if that search consumes resources that could be used to help living victims of persecution? Or does the search itself serve important purposes, demonstrating that moral courage will not be forgotten, that those who risk everything for others will not be abandoned by history. The answer seems to lie in the dual nature of the investigation itself. The search for truth about Wallenberg's disappearance has simultaneously preserved his legacy and inspired new generations of rescuers. Every documentary produced, every archive opened, every witness interviewed, has spread his story to audiences who might otherwise never have encountered it. The investigation has become a form of education, the mystery a vehicle for moral instruction. Modern technology continues to offer new possibilities for solving the case. Satellite archaeology can identify former prison sites that have been demolished or concealed. Digital forensics can detect alterations in documents that were invisible to earlier investigators. DNA analysis could potentially identify remains, even if they have been deliberately mislabeled or hidden. Yet each technological advance also reveals how much evidence has been permanently lost. Witnesses have died, documents have been destroyed, physical sites have been demolished. The window for definitive answers grows narrower with each passing year, making the investigation increasingly dependent on archaeological detective work rather than living testimony. Perhaps this is appropriate. Wallenberg's story has always operated in the space between certainty and doubt, between documentation and mystery, between historical fact and moral challenge. His legacy thrives in uncertainty, because it demands that each generation take responsibility for carrying his work forward rather than simply remembering his accomplishments. The eternal mystery of his fate has transformed him into something more powerful than any historical figure, whose story has clear beginning, middle, and end. He has become a permanent question mark in human consciousness, a reminder that moral courage remains unfinished business requiring constant renewal. Every time someone chooses to intervene rather than ignore persecution, every time an individual challenges systematic injustice, every time a person risks personal safety to protect strangers, Wallenberg's influence continues. His disappearance into the Soviet system may have ended his physical rescue operations, but it began something larger, the immortalization of his methods, his courage, and his fundamental belief that every human life possesses infinite worth. The search for Raoul Wallenberg will continue as long as there are people willing to ask difficult questions about moral responsibility. Whether he died in 1947 or survived for decades longer, whether he was executed or died of natural causes, whether his remains will ever be found or forever remain hidden, these questions matter less than the question he poses to each of us. What will you do when evil assumes that good people will choose to do nothing? That question requires no archives to answer, no documents to resolve, no historical investigation to address. It requires only conscience, courage, and the recognition that Wallenberg's most important legacy is not the mystery of his disappearance, but the clarity of his example while he lived.